Jack and Marc present The History of Democracy, Part 2.
They said, listen, we've got to figure out a way to decide things. Why don't we vote on it? That was Vladimir Contusion, and his name began with a V, so that's where vote came from.
How did they vote? Like nowadays, you make off a piece of paper and they count the X's, but in those days, each person would have to have a special pebble or a special stick that would represent their vote.
They would have to find a rock that could not be confused with a rock for the other side. Let's say you think the fire should be on Wednesdays. You'd have to find a rock that represented the word Wednesday. The other guy who thinks it's Thursdays finds a rock which represents Thursday, and you throw them all to a pile. And the counting system wasn't really scrutinized. They didn't have scrutineers back then. This was when Vaseline Hound Dog, he would be the one that did the counting. He was biased.
Oh yeah, well, everyone was biased in those days.
Bias had just been invented.
What about this guy Vladimir Contusion?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't he just try to vote more than once, and he tried to acquire a huge pile of rocks, but they all came crashing down on him, and he got one of the world's first concussions?
Contusion is kind of what he was known amongst friends, right? Hey, you're my friend, you can call me Contusion. His real name was Vladimir Concussion.
Oh, yeah. Well, he had to change his name. He didn't want anyone to be associated with the time he tried to voting by bringing in more than one rock.
Vote early, vote often was his motto.
And he tried to wear all different disguises, too.
What were the disguises like back then?
It was ridiculous. He came in as a hedge, I heard.
Oh, like in war tactics. That's where Napoleon got his idea, to attack people that looked like hedges.
And Napoleon was right in proclaiming that never trust a hedge, because the hedge might not be a hedge.
In fact, Vaseline Hound Dog, originally he was known as Vaseline Hedgehog, but he changed it to Hound Dog for that very reason. He would dress as a hedge, or he'd put some rocks on his head, or sometimes he would carry 2 rocks in his right hand, and he would come and vote, and then he'd come back later, and he'd have the same hand. And he'd say, well, I'm a different guy. The other guy had 2 rocks in the right hand. And of course, back then, they didn't catch that subtlety.
He also underestimated other people's intelligence. Got himself in some trouble when he did come across someone smarter than him.
Most people were smarter than him, because he had all those concussions. Concussions make you a bit stupid.
Yeah, they're not good for you, especially when you don't remove the embedded object in the top of your skull. Because again, no medical science. If you survived a bad thing, like a branch sticking through your lower abdomen, and you survived, people would usually keep that as a mark of excellence, as a conversation piece. There's no one more popular at a caveman party than the guy with a branch sticking out of his abdomen.
Or through his brain, like Phineas Gage, the guy who got a javelin that went right through his skull.
Oh.
It was some kind of railroad accident. That happened a lot in those times, too. People would have things shot right through their skull, and they would get their names based on what part of the brain was affected. If it affected their ability to do math or wash clothes, there was one guy who a pebble went right through his brain, and it destroyed his ability to wash clothes. So he was called Washburn Nahina. Then there was a guy, it affected his ability to fall asleep.
And there was a guy once who actually had a hedgehog stuck under his arm.
Oh, that was horrible.
And he lost all ability to be polite.
His name was Tourette, for Tourette's syndrome.
Names like your name, Marc, or Jack, or Margarita, or Joe. These names, they're kind of abstract, and they don't really represent a physical object in the world. And so they got their names from all these obscure, forgotten things that are now lost in history, and we only find about it when the definition or a recording of it on a cave wall somewhere.
Well, what does Jack mean? Have you researched the meaning of the word Jack?
It came from someone being able to lift very heavy objects. Well, nowadays, it'd be lifter of large automobiles. Is it Jack?
My name, Marc. It's an old word. It means burrow under the sand and run a 100-meter dash. It's very specific.
From one of the first athletic competitions.
The Neanderthal Olympics.
Oh, the Neanderthal Olympics. Yes, of course. They had audiences from watching the rock-throwing debates amongst the politicians. So then I guess the audiences, after a while, kind of went, well, okay, we've seen this new.
But something fun. And they'd go to the Olympics.
They had rock-throwing competitions, and they had already been doing that when they were voting.
Well, they were pretty good. Those rocketicians, they would always enter. They'd be ringers in the Neanderthal Olympics. What were some of the other events, though?
Well, of course, we know there's Wrestle the Mastodon, and then there was
Catch the Javelin.
Okay, that was always popular.
It was have a javelin pierce your brain.
That only lasted about 10 minutes in those days, because then they said, this isn't working out. That was a pretty popular guy, and now he's not moving anymore. And so they thought maybe they shouldn't do that one. Nowadays they have swimming competition, but no one knew how to swim. So there was the run out into the water competition. Knew how to swim. So there was the run out into the water competition. And these guys would all go running out into the water, and the person who came back was the winner. Of course, that had a high death rate as well.
What if more than one came back? It was at a race? Is it the first one to come back?
10 would go running out. They had to run out to the level of their heads, and then they had to run back. And that was the competition. Understanding of undercurrents and large predator fish. It was always fraught with mishap.
If you have to run up to the level of your head, that would favor the short guys.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because the short guys tended to win all the time.
And they came back.
The rules were that you just had to run up to under your chin, and then you could run back. So the short guys were winning. So they have a concept of height in those days.
Some of those tall guys cheated. They would kneel down when they ran out.
Oh, yes. Well, there's always the cheaters.
And that was a big scandal. That was the steroids of the time.
Steroids of the time was cheating. Nowadays, they get tested for steroids. In those days, they got tested for cheating. They had to see how truthful someone might be.
Wasn't there a bowling with shot put? Wasn't that one? What is the name of the thing you're throwing?
I think they just shot put a very small man in those days, because that way they didn't have to return the shot put. He could run back.
He would take his knees and bring them up to his chest, and he would get in a little ball.
And they would throw him, and then he would land in some sand or something, and then he would come running back. Because people forget that it's tough being a Neanderthal, and it's hard. And who the hell wants to go chase a shot put after you've thrown it?
Right.
Big debates about who's going to go get it. The first shot put competition, Neanderthal threw it like a pretty considerable distance, and they said, all right, well, who's going to go get it? I'm not going to go get it. I threw it. And then they didn't have any judges or any jobs classified at that point. There was a big brawl, and then they settled it by saying, well, just throw a very small man curled up in a ball, and he'll run back. And everyone was in agreement with that.
His name was Carl.
Yeah, Carl the shot put.
It was called Throwing the Carl.
Yeah, Throwing the Carl. That was the name of the competition, really, before it got called a shot put. It was Throwing the Carl.
They didn't have a lot of endurance, the Neanderthals, so they didn't have a 100-yard dash. They had a 1-yard dash.
Oh, yes, the 1-yard dash. That was always thrilling, because it went by so fast you had to pay attention.
It was called the most exciting 10 milliseconds in sports. Of course, they didn't have milliseconds back then.
And it was hard to choose who won. They just had, and then the first chest to hit the stick, it wins. Well, the guy who was holding the stick, he usually had to run away because everyone got pissed off and said, my chest hit it first, and my chest hit it first. Then it was a big brawl again.
Well, then you'd also get these false starts, too. Like in today's Olympics, when the gun goes off, you're not allowed to start within a certain amount of time. I don't know, maybe a tenth of a second. If you start less than a tenth of a second after the gun goes off, they know you were trying to anticipate the start. It's a penalty. It's called a false start. You're out of the race. That was a big problem for them, right? So they'd have 200 guys line up at the start line, and the finish line was 1 yard away, and they were always culling people for false starts.
And all those people who got culled, they had to go back and participate in the more unsavory competitions as punishment, like wrestle the rabid hyenas, which was a popular sport.
Well, yeah, and the object was not to get bitten.
Yeah. Most of the time you just run away. Then they discovered that some guys can run faster than others. And they said, we should have a competition of people running. And that was one of the first running. And they said, but how do you run? And they said, well, you've got to run more than 1 meter. And then there was, of course, big debate again, and then there was another brawl.
I don't think it was 1 meter. I think it was 1 yard. The metric system hadn't been invented. The yards had just been invented.
Well, there was a lot of brawls, and I think the brawls became a competition, but it was hard to determine who won a brawl. Well, the last person standing.
Sometimes a guy would fall, he'd get back up, he'd fall, he'd get back up. So you had to be standing for 1 hour uninterrupted.
That's right. 1 hour uninterrupted standing made you the winner.
And then you were allowed to fight. Well, if there were 2 guys standing and they'd been standing for 59 minutes each, you could push the other guy down and you'd be the champion.
Yeah, I think that was one of the legitimate competitions amongst Neanderthals that was developed. And then, of course, I think the Homo sapiens, then they came in and they claimed that they were the inventor of the standing high jump. Then they demanded that Neanderthals all participate in their Olympics.
The thing about the Homo sapiens is they kind of were the organizers of the Olympics. Neanderthals were the participants. So the Homo sapiens were basically exploiting the Neanderthals.
Yeah, they were selling mangoes and produce and stuff to the audience. They were the ones making all the profit and so forth, while the Neanderthals are all beating the hell out of themselves just trying to be able to say they're best at something.
Now, wasn't there also another event called Stay Alive? That's it. That was the only rule, was stay alive. You'd put them all in the Colosseum and you'd put 100 of them in there, and you would just say, on your mark, get set, stay alive.
That was popular as well. The Romans, of course, adopted that whole competition. They would just release lions and say, stay alive.
At the end of that competition, you'd have one guy still alive, and he old. And the last guy to die, he would win the silver. And the guy who died second last, he would win the bronze. Basically, the longer you're alive, the greater the prize. And then they'd award the medal. Of course, the guy who's alive, he'd get his medal. The other two guys, they kind of plop their bodies on the medal awarding stand, and they'd pin a medal onto them. Congratulations, you didn't win.
Quite proud. He died, but at least he got a medal.
We have concluded our broadcast schedule for today. Good night.